Hi, this is my first time doing this. I'm not even sure how to use this camera. But there's something I need to say. I've been writing a lot about how to improve conversations between the gay community and religious conservatives. I feel like I need to explain why I'm motivated to do this. I didn't seek out this conversation. I didn't go to graduate school to focus on this. But it ended up that my advisor to my dissertation on antidepressants was a lesbian neuroscientist who was pretty life-changing. I also ended up teaching a course in collaboration with a liberal-leaning classmate, bringing together conservative and liberal students to talk about tough questions, like gay rights in America. The students in our class would often talk about how this was the first time they had ever had a productive conversation about gay rights, or abortion, or the Iraqi war at the time. It was baffling to me that in 23 years of life they hadn't experienced something like this. Going on to share that at conferences is what led me to meet so many others who had similar desire to have these conversations. And I have had so much fun in the last decade with Tracy, with Phil, Arthur, John, Rich, Kendall, so many others. How we saw our identities vastly differed from Mormon to Marxist, Unitarian to evangelical, as lesbian and gay and queer, and we had a wonderful experience. We disagreed vociferously about pretty much everything, and that was okay, and that we were going to love each other in that space, and we were going to hear each other out in that space. So fun. I can't tell you. It's no exaggeration to say some of the highlights of my life have come out of those experiences. Sweetness and power and enjoyment that is unrivaled in many other interactions I've had. So with that in my past, from where I sit now, I have not been able to help but look out at all the other conversations going on and be awestruck at how heavy and how fraught and full of accusation and hardness and ugliness, and mourn to see how awful it has become. Not just in relation to this issue, but all sorts of conversations. We are hardly talking about anything in a way that feels productive anymore, including gay rights. There is so much suffering in this conversation, and I have to say, why? Why does this have to be so painful? And my answer to that question is, it doesn't have to be this painful. I know it. I've not only seen it different, I have lived a different conversation, and it's been amazing. And that's why I have written what I have written. Everything I've written is an attempt to say, what if we did it this way? What if we could come together and have a conversation about the different ways of trying to be loving and compassionate in the world? We don't agree on that. Philosophers haven't agreed on the meaning of love since the history of the world. How could we suddenly come to take for granted that we all know what that means? Hey, what if we talk about how we've arrived at different conclusions about choice and the different interesting ways of thinking about choice in relation to sexuality? And how about our different conclusions about who we are? Fundamentally different conclusions. How fascinating that would be if we talked about it. And let's accept from the outset that we're not going to agree on that. I've got plenty of evangelical and Baptist friends that think my way of seeing who I am is not just batty, but blasphemous. And they fear for my soul, for my belief that I can become more like my Father in heaven. It does not matter for how we are in relation to each other. That would be an amazing conversation to have. Thinking about coming together to explore fundamental differences we have in how we see things. That is not the conversation we're having in America today. It's not the conversation we've been having. It's far removed from the conversation we're having. Instead of that, you know how it goes. The conversation we have runs more like this. Do you love people? Are you willing to accept people as they really are? Are you inclusive? Then what are you waiting for? We're ready for you to join us. That is not an exaggeration of how this conversation's going. Almost everywhere you look, you see that pattern. So what's the problem with it? It is not honest. It's not an honest conversation. It does not acknowledge the actual disagreements we hold. It doesn't acknowledge that different, thoughtful, good-hearted human beings have reached different conclusions about identity, sexuality, choice, change, God, etc. It doesn't. It's common to hear people ask the question, do you believe that being gay is a choice? With the insinuation that many religious conservatives believe that. I have never met personally any religious conservative who actually believes that we can choose to be attracted in a certain way. That is not the kind of choice that we talk about in relation to sexuality. There are lots of other choices in terms of how we respond to our sexual attractions and how we choose to identify based on our sexual attractions and our political commitments and our religious feelings. That's also a choice. Most philosophers today would agree in the social construction of identity. That's very well accepted. But we hardly ever talk about those choices, nor is it even acknowledged in the conversation that there are different ways of thinking about choice. That, again, is just not honest. And that's the kind of conversation that I think could make such a difference if we just put that on the table and say, how interesting that we've reached different conclusions about not only choice, not only love, but pretty much everything, and how the body plays into this, and our faith, and what God thinks, and rights, and change, and what does it mean to change, right? There's a kind of a sense that if you believe change is possible, it's this aggressive, forced, I'm going to fix you sort of change. But there are mindfulness approaches to change that are very gentle. There are Christian approaches to change that talk about God moving in us and changing our hearts and moving us in a direction over time. That almost never figures into our conversations about change. It's always this sort of, if you believe change is possible, you must be one of those aggressive people. That's just not true. It has been in the past, and it may have been much more in the past, but there are lots of ways of thinking about these things. And can we talk about them? That's really what I'm asking. Can we? And I know this is not a simple question. I know from my experience writing about this stuff that there are some who just honestly will say and feel, no, I don't want to. I have been surprised at how many people just aren't interested in another kind of conversation. They're not interested in the kind of conversation that I'm describing here. Why not? Why not? I find that question really puzzling and fascinating. And I can tell you my own conclusion. is that if people went the direction I'm suggesting, it may not be as effective for the gay rights movement. It just may not. There's something very persuasive about how the conversation is set up right now. It leads people along a certain path, as I've argued in other writing. It moves them in a certain direction towards progressive conclusions. If that is your primary aim, to make sure people come to agree with progressive conclusions about sexuality and identity and choice and change and God, a progressive view of the gospel, then I can understand why you're not interested in this. Because the primary aim of this approach is not a certain conclusion. My primary goal is not that everyone will reach a conclusion that I have. It's that we can have a conversation where everything's on the table and that we can really allow that conversation to guide us where we need to go. I trust a space of conversation that is honest and open and fair. When I have seen people gather in a space where they're really open to hearing all the ideas out, there is something beautiful that happens in that space. The German philosopher Gadamer wrote about dialogue many, many years ago. He describes one horizon coming together with a second horizon, and a fusion of horizons where something new emerges, a third horizon. He calls it an event of understanding. He describes it in almost mystical terms as these people come together and something new emerges. I have felt that over and over with my Marxist friends, my atheist friends, my gay, lesbian, transgender identifying friends. I feel a sacred, beautiful thing happening. Again, which is so different than the kind of conversation that we're having in society today. So much accusation. The opposite happens. When that conversation is full of accusation and harsh kinds of statements, there is no God in that space. There's nothing sacred or beautiful going on. It is dark. It is oppressive and heavy. And that conversation, I am absolutely convinced, leads people to a place of despair. It leads to a kind of hopelessness. It is a factor in some of the suicidal ideation that happens. Because it sets up a conversation where you cannot be thoughtful and disagree. This is not some intellectual puzzle we're talking about. I believe it has consequences for the teenagers that people of all perspectives are worried about. Imagine someone growing up in the church, hearing their whole life from leaders and prophets about who they are, their eternal possibilities, trusting these leaders to help them understand meaning and purpose, taking for granted that these people love them and that they're trustworthy, and then at some point being introduced to another conversation entirely, where not only they're introduced to another way of thinking about who they are, but that also all that they heard and those people that told them that actually didn't love them after all. Actually, there is an inherent hatred for their very identity. And all the things you've trusted and for meaning and purpose, all of a sudden lose all their power and their goodness and their truth. You'd have to be crazy not to think that that transition alone, laying everything else aside, is not a factor in the suicidal ideation going on. At the very least, it's profoundly jarring and disorienting. But the despair, the heaviness, the heartbreak of feeling almost forced to walk away from all of that, That's why we have to pay attention to this conversation. That's why it has to broaden. Because as long as it's so narrow that we cannot actually disagree about what love is, or identity, or choice, or all the many other things involved, as long as we cannot do that and make space for these disagreements to exist, I mean real space, not like you can have that disagreement and be a hateful, awful person that hates gay people. That's not space. That's a chasm. And that is the war that I've described elsewhere, Arthur, quoting Arthur, the war that is upon us. Because despite my interest and my excitement about this direction, I know full well that most people are not going to be interested in this. This is not going to be attractive enough to draw people away from the deep emotions and often dark feelings, intense emotion that can propel them to just hold on to what they know. I also feel the anger on occasion. I feel the same frustration, and I try my best to let it pass through me and out. And I pray for those that I consider enemies in this conversation, real enemies, people who are stirring up the conversation to such a degree that heaviness and ugliness are everywhere we look. That doesn't mean we can't challenge each other. I've been very direct about concerns that I have about certain approaches, methods, certain voices, certain stances. We all ought to be able to do that and say, this is why I think this argument is really damaging. That's very different than demonizing and accusing the people who hold the argument of being Darth Vader. As John Stewart said at his rally to restore sanity, I disagree with you, but I'm pretty sure you're not Hitler. I disagree with you, I'm pretty sure you're not the devil. Let's see our humanity enough to have the hard conversations. This is not some nimble toe, let's make sure to not say anything that would make anyone possibly feel discomfort. That is no conversation at all. That is a very elegant way to silence all of us. We have to fight for a conversation where we can be honest with each other, including about our pain, our frustration. We can acknowledge, I'm really frustrated about this. I'm frustrated that you've said that and that you're advocating that. And I don't understand how you could believe that this is going to help. Imagine if we could hear that. And a lot of people are feeling that right now from all different sides. There's no question that there are things that religious leaders have said that have caused unnecessary suffering, and in ways they have said it. And there's no question in my mind that the same thing has happened on the other side. And where that has happened, our community has, I believe, committed to trying harder and doing better. But it doesn't ever seem to be enough. I don't think it ever will be enough. Especially on matters that are so personal and sensitive, we need to be able to inquire and question and say, look, I appreciate your intentions. I don't think I agree with where you've landed. Can we talk about that? We can hold the seriousness of these disagreements in the space between us and pay our best attention to trying to figure out what to do. I would argue that the importance of the questions before us requires the most quality and productive conversation we can bring to it. The kind of conversation I'm describing will be more searching and more scrutinizing than anything you've experienced. There is more room to directly ask each other questions. I can call up any of my conversation partners I described and ask them anything. I can ask Tracy anything, or Arthur, or Phil, and it's a joy. Good, thoughtful human beings have reached different conclusions about all sorts of things, including these matters of sexuality. That's not something that many people are even able to admit or believe anymore. In fact, I would say thoughtful, good-hearted people have reached disagreements about pretty much everything in the world. That assumption is simply not present in most of our conversations about gay rights and religious freedom today. If you disagree with me, that means you must not have enough empathy. You must not love them like I do. You must not have enough faith as I do if you disagree with me. You must not have as much character. You must not have as much goodness in your soul. Now, I'm starting to get tongue-in-cheek, but you know what I'm talking about. Isn't that true? Tell me right now. So this is my plea today, that we would begin to insist more on having a conversation that accurately characterizes what we actually disagree about. That's it. That's my plea. I'm actually sitting on the floor, pleading with you. If you're more committed to your activism or your proselyting, that you're willing to say anything to get someone to reach a conclusion similar to yours, you are part of the problem. If Machiavellian ethics are what drives our public discourse, look, I'm going to say whatever I can to make sure it happens, then we're in trouble. And there are a lot of people in that boat right now. Wherever someone is vocalizing something that is leading to a conversation that doesn't allow thoughtful disagreement, that's what I'm trying to call attention to. If we could just agree to work toward a conversation that allows that kind of disagreement, we would be far, far ahead. Now you might understandably ask yourself, how is this conservative guy proposing a more honest conversation when the honest conversation we need is for his community to own up to the pain and suffering they themselves have caused? Now, speaking for anyone in my community, yes, this concern needs to be represented in the conversation. Is there any risk of it not being represented, however? I hear it a lot. It's brought up quite frequently, often presented as the cause, the singular reason that the gay community is suffering. And once again, I'd suggest this is another place where a more honest conversation could make a lot of difference. Can we talk about the different perspectives on where the suffering is coming from and the different factors giving rise to it? Maybe, maybe not. I don't always see a willingness for that to happen. But if we can't, let's just be honest on what we're doing. That the conversation we're having is not actually a conversation about the different perspectives on suffering. We don't have everything on the table. It's more of that pseudo conversation where let's talk, let's have a conversation so that one perspective can be heard and followed and implemented. I don't believe there is any social scientist anywhere that actually believes mental emotional distress arises from a singular factor. Even a factor such as a conflict between a certain belief system and how someone has come to see themselves and chosen to live. I know this is a sensitive issue. It's probably the most sensitive question. But once again, would that not suggest that we even be more careful to make sure our conversation includes everything on the table. Right now, it does not. That would be an honest assessment of our conversation about suffering and suicidality. It just does not. On the day I got the phone call in graduate school that my brother was coming home from the hospital and that the doctors had essentially given up, that there's nothing more we can do for your cancer, my 22-year-old brother, I was in the kind of the commons area of graduate students, and my lesbian classmate Adrian was there. And she was the only one there. She just held me, and that was it. Just received the news with her. It was later in graduate school that my mother, also facing her own cancer, was in the hospital for a month, nauseous. And I was communicating this with Wendy, my dissertation chair, and she scoured her naturopathic book of remedies to find, she called me up and said, "Jacob, have you guys tried probiotics?" And going out of her way to find something that might help my mother. I called up my dad in the hospital and I said, "Dad, probiotics, we'd never heard of it. The oncologist never let us know about anything like that." He went to the health food store, got her this probiotic thing, took it to the hospital, and immediately her nausea started to decrease. I think that won me over for Wendy for a lifetime at least. I felt in her home and with her partner and invited to be there often, a kind of maternal love from both of them, far away from home. And so here's the thing. Don't tell me that I cannot love Wendy and Adrian, Arthur, Tracy, John, Rich, Kendall, without agreeing with them on who they are, on how they see themselves, their life. With each of these individuals, I hold deep, vociferous disagreements. And it matters not at all when it comes to the affection that we share. In fact, I think many of them would agree that much of the affection we share has arisen out of our commitment to not just explore these differences, but to hang with each other despite them. If you haven't had this experience, I hope you will envy the possibility of having someone in your life that disagrees with you fundamentally about how the world works and God and the universe. Someone that you can call up and ask anything. I mean, really anything. What you really are wondering. I've got a lot of friends like that. And it makes life very sweet. And once again, that's just not the conversation we're having right now about gay rights or about pretty much anything in our country. And that's why I can't stop talking about this, because I know it's possible. And it may be scary and uncomfortable and challenging. I know it is to move in another direction, but what other alternative do we have? Honestly, let's move in this direction. Let's move away from the ugliness and the aggression, the accusation. I relish my time with these people, and I adore them. I didn't even get Christmas presents for anyone in my family, but I got Christmas present for Arthur, Tracy, Phil. I had to. I just saw this and I gotta send this to them. So please, think about this. Thank you for your time. That's all.